Good day, gentlemen. I wanted to make what should be a pretty quick video on something that I see regularly, which is this idea that the United States is not a democracy. And you see this from especially more of your conservative-minded, right-leaning people more often than people on the left. But I wanted to give my own opinion on this, and this may be kind of unpopular, right? I'm sure that there are some people that will disagree with this, but I do think the evidence is kind of on the side that, yes, the United States is a democracy. I want to explain why I think that is. Honestly, the problem with the definition of democracy that people try to use when they're saying that the United States is a constitutional republic, and I do get the argument. The argument is that because you have representative government and because you have constitutional rights that are supposed to theoretically protect you from mob rule and theoretically limit the amount of power that the average person has over leadership decisions and all that, I get the idea that because we have a constitution and because we have representative government, that somehow that makes us not a democracy because that's not the way that things were supposed to work. And it's not the way the United States used to be. I agree that we weren't a democracy when we were founded as a country. And I'm talking about the United States specifically here, obviously. The problem with that argument has basically several different connotations. One, you have universal suffrage. Everybody does have at least a nominal say in terms of how the government is not constructed, but the leadership positions that you have and how it's actually orchestrated. Theoretically, everybody has the right to vote unless you're a convict, you're a child, or maybe you're mentally incompetent in a literal sense, right? So you have universal suffrage guaranteeing everybody some level of representation, even if it's just nominal. Then you also have the problem of, and this is really the biggest point, I think, name a democracy besides ancient Athens that wasn't a representative form of democracy, right? Name a democracy that wasn't an ancient Greek city-state that meets the definition of democracy that you're seeing used when people try to say that, no, the United States is actually a constitutional republic. Because what you have to have is a system of government where the people directly decide everything if you're not going to have representation. If you're not going to elect representatives who then decide on policy, at least in theory. And in practice, a lot of it's done by executive branch agencies and stuff like that, bureaucracy, and those people are just appointed. But at least in theory, even in the system we have in the United States now and in other Western countries to a large degree, people can vote and then everybody basically is nominally represented. And then those representatives, those elected officials, get to make the decisions. Name another form of actual democracy then. Because the problem that you're faced with is that it almost becomes like the this isn't real communism argument that you see from far lefties. It becomes similar to that, not necessarily in the sense of what it's trying to argue, but in the fact that, yes, we have seen real communism. We have seen real socialism. Trying to refer to some sort of abstract construct of what socialism and communism is supposed to look like doesn't mean crap when every time that it's been tried, it looks like what it looks like, which is usually a totalitarian form of government, more or less, where people have no rights and people can't own land and so on and so forth after a certain point. Maybe with socialism, you could say people sort of still have certain rights, but they still can't really own anything, and everything they do is taxed and given to other people, right? You almost have the same thing going on here. Well, that's not real democracy. Although, again, it's not the same argument because the idea is to try to say that you don't have that system in place rather than saying that we can try to have that system in place, right? It's not necessarily an argument for democracy in this case, but it's to say that that's not the system that we're actually seeing. That's not the system that we actually have. Well, I'm going to argue that it is. This is the closest thing that you can get to people being directly represented. There is no other form of democracy unless you want to talk about ancient Greek city-states. And if you guys know of an example of a system of pure direct democracy that's existed in the last several centuries in any meaningful way, right? Beyond very small scale, maybe city-state type of organizations, which I don't even think it has. Like even in the Middle Ages, I don't think those institutions existed. Then go ahead and let me know why I'm wrong. But we don't live in a constitutional republic anymore. In theory, we still have a constitution, right? We still have a constitutional form of government that's supposed to protect people's rights and that's supposed to be beyond democracy and essentially the majority ruling everything. So I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but in effect, we have a democracy. In effect, this is pretty much a government that the people do decide upon, even if you have a lot of corruption, you have party politics, you have bureaucracy. I understand all that. But this is democracy, guys. And to say, well, no, the Constitution says this and that, I get it. But since everyone has been given the right to vote, I'm going to say that we live in a democracy. You have universal suffrage, and that is a much better definition for what democracy is than, well, you don't have a democracy unless everybody votes directly on everything, which is a nonsense because there are zero examples of that within the last 500 years that I'm aware of. It's just not something that is a practical definition for anything because that version of democracy is not practical. And the problem, again, is people want, a lot of these traditional conservatives, and this is kind of my final point, they want to believe that we still live in a constitutional republic. They want to believe that the vision of the founding fathers and the early Republican system, small r Republican, right, not the party, but that form of government, that somehow has persevered, and that somehow is still what we have going on today. And it really just isn't, guys. Now that you have universal suffrage, you essentially have democracy. I would argue you have mob rule, right? I'm not really keen on democracy as the best form of government. I know a lot of people believe that. I think that those people are kind of indoctrinated more or less into believing that. They don't really understand sort of history and ideology and how politics kind of develops. But in other words, I don't really believe that the people are equipped to make decisions, and probably a lot of people shouldn't vote, in other words. But most people believe that, democracy is this wonderful thing and everyone should go vote and all this other kind of stuff, regardless of where you stand on that, though. Whether you think democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other governments that have been tried, like Churchill said. But either way, we do live in a democracy. Western countries are democracies today. This is what you get, in my opinion, with democracy. Yes, the United States in particular has a constitution where your rights are still supposed to be protected, and that is a good thing. We are much better off with that constitution, but we're not really a constitutional republic anymore, at least not in practice. Once you give everyone the right to vote, you pretty much have government that's decided on by the people, and then all you have to do is corrupt enough people to want free stuff, to want Marxism of some form, to want some form of, basically bad government, and then that's what they're going to get. All you have to do is socially engineer the population as a whole. And I would argue that that's a big flaw within democracy itself, but to then take a step back and try to sit there and say, well, we don't have a democracy, Dan. You don't know what you're talking about. These people need to read the Constitution. I get it, but it's not practical. Because then democracy is something that hasn't existed for 500 years at least anyway. Something that hasn't existed outside of ancient Athens where people literally did vote on every issue. That's not a practical definition of democracy. In practice, democracy is universal suffrage. And because that's the case, in my opinion at least, we pretty much have a democracy. We have a system where everybody participates at some level politically, or can, even if it's a waste of time, right? And ultimately this idea that, well, no, we're not really a democracy and we need to get away from that, that's not going to help anything. This is reality, the way that I see it at least, and we're not better served by saying we don't have democracy in this environment. This is as close as you're realistically going to get to democracy. In essence, we do have a democratic form of government. It's a representative democracy, but so what? It's just as much of a democracy as anything else that's realistic, right? This actually is probably as close as you're going to get to that idea. And I don't think that saying, well, we really don't have a democracy, we have a Republican form of government, that's not realistic once universal suffrage is established even if you want to make that technical type of argument.